How dare you ruin the community like this? Diane's voice broke through the tense silence, her hands on her hips as she glared at him, every inch of her stance accusatory. Jared clenched his fists, trying to calm the rising frustration. "Didn't ask for this," he spat back, his voice low but steady. "You don't get it, do you?" "This is the HOA's property too," she continued, her face red with indignation. "It's our responsibility to keep things in order. And you," she pointed an accusing finger at him, "have turned this entire pond into a mess. The EPA has already issued a fine because of you. Do you even realize what you've done? You've made the whole neighborhood look bad." Jared's breath quickened, panic creeping into his mind. A fine. He had spent months planning the landscaping for his backyard. The pond wasn't a hazard. It was a sanctuary, home to frogs and fish, a little oasis where he could unwind after long days. Diane had been nothing but a thorn in his side since he moved in constantly, nitpicking every little thing. He hadn't expected her to be so quick to sabotage his property. "What are you talking about?" "I haven't," he started, but Diane cut him off with a condescending laugh. "You've broken the law, Jared. It's not a joke anymore. Now, the EPA is fining us $10,000 a day, all because you didn't follow the proper channels. You thought you could bypass us, didn't you?" Jared's head spun. He hadn't done anything wrong. In fact, he'd gone through all the necessary steps to ensure his pond was legal. He'd even consulted with a landscaper. "I followed the rules, Diane. I called the environmental agency before starting any work. I didn't do anything wrong." Her smile twisted with mock sympathy. "Oh, sweetie, that's just it. You didn't go through the HOA approval process. And because of you, we're facing a serious problem. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you should have thought this through." The words hit Jared harder than he expected. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the complete dismissal of his efforts. He looked around, watching the neighbors peek through their curtains, their faces painted with the same judgment Diane wore. No one was on his side. Just when it felt like the walls were closing in, a glimmer of hope flickered. One of the other residents, Greg, stood off to the side, his arms folded. He was an older man, a former contractor, and known for his impartial nature. Greg stepped forward, his eyes narrowed as he addressed Diane. "Hold on a minute, Jared's right. He called the environmental agency, didn't he? I remember hearing about it when he first started. And besides, that pond was always just fine." Diane's eyes narrowed. "You're taking his side now, Greg." Greg shrugged, clearly unimpressed by her scorn. "I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying, we should look into this. Maybe it's not all Jared's fault." The tension in the air seemed to snap. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but paused, glancing quickly over at the others. Jared could see the hesitation in her eyes. Something wasn't adding up, and for the first time, he felt like he might not be alone in this fight. "Maybe you should have just kept your hands off my property, Diane," Jared muttered, a quiet but defiant growl in his voice. She glared at him, not backing down. "I'm just trying to protect the community, Jared. If you want to be difficult, fine, but you'll have to deal with the consequences. The HOA isn't going to let you ruin this place for everyone else." At that moment, Jared felt a shift in the era change in the tide. He wasn't going to back down. The truth was on his side. There was something bigger at play here, and he wasn't about to let it go without a fight. Just before Diane could fire back, Jared's phone buzzed. It was an email notification from the EPA. The subject line read, "Revised Inspection Report. Pond Legal Status." His stomach dropped as he read the message. "We have confirmed the pond is compliant with local regulations. We are revising the fine from $10,000 to $0. Apologies for the misunderstanding." Jared's heart raced as the realization hit him like a punch. Diane had been misinformed, and the fine was never his fault. The twist was clear. She had overstepped, weaponizing her position to control him. And now she'd be forced to reckon with the truth. Jared wasn't the problem. Diane was. Jared's hands trembled as he stared at the email on his phone. It felt surreal, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. But the lingering bitterness of being wrongly accused still gnawed at him. He looked up from the screen to find Diane still standing there, her arms crossed over her chest in defiance. He wanted to yell at her, but instead, he simply held up his phone. "Look at this," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. Diane's eyes darted toward the phone, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she kept that stubborn scowl fixed on her face, like she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "What's this supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice laced with sarcasm. "It means the EPA just cleared my pond," Jared replied, his voice growing more confident with each word. "There's no fine, Diane, no violation. They made a mistake, and now it's fixed. You've been pushing this narrative about me ruining the neighborhood, when the truth is, you were misinformed from the start." Her jaw tightened, her face reddening. For a moment, it seemed like she might explode. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat as her gaze flicked around. Clearly feeling the pressure of the neighborhood's attention, Greg, who had been standing quietly off to the side, stepped forward once more. "You see, Diane, it wasn't all on Jared. There's been some confusion. And maybe it's time we get the whole story straight instead of jumping to conclusions." Jared's eyes met Greg's, the older man's gaze steady and unwavering. It was clear now that Greg wasn't just trying to play the middle. He was willing to back Jared, even if it meant challenging Diane's authority. Diane turned sharply on her heel, her heels clicking angrily against the pavement as she paced away. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath. But Jared could hear the uncertainty in her tone. It was the first crack in the facade she had built, and he wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. "Isn't it?" Jared called after her. "It's over for me, but for you, that's a different story." Diane froze for a moment, then turned back slowly, her face twisted with contempt. "What do you think you're doing, Jared? Do you really think I'm going to let you walk away from this without consequences? You already have," he shot back. "You were wrong, and now you have to live with that. But if you think I'm going to let you bully me again, you're mistaken." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. The other neighbors seemed to shrink back, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, but Jared couldn't help himself. He wasn't going to back down. Now, Diane's expression faltered, and she looked around at the group. The pride in her eyes was gone, replaced by something much darker. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Jared was. The days that followed were strangely quiet. Diane's usual daily patrols through the neighborhood, looking for anything she could criticize, came to an abrupt halt. Jared couldn't help but notice the shift. The tension that had once permeated every interaction had dissipated, replaced by an uneasy calm. Diane kept her distance, no longer running the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, but Jared wasn't ready to let her off the hook just yet. He'd spent days obsessing over the email, making sure he hadn't missed something. He couldn't afford to let the situation slide so easily. Diane's overreach had cost him too much. One evening, Jared ran into Greg at the local hardware store. The older man was picking through some lumber, humming to himself as he inspected the selection. Jared approached him slowly, his mind still processing everything. "Greg," he started, his voice low. "I owe you one for standing up for me." Greg looked up, his face breaking into a small smile. "You don't owe me anything, Jared. Seen too many people let themselves get steamrolled by people like Diane. She's not as untouchable as she thinks." Jared nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, but his gaze darkened when he spoke again. "She's still out there, though, still pulling strings. I'm not just going to let her walk away from this. I want to make sure she knows that what she did was wrong." Greg paused, putting down the piece of wood he'd been inspecting. "What do you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet," Jared admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I'm thinking of making this public. Let the whole neighborhood see what she tried to pull. If people knew how she manipulated the situation, maybe they'd stop letting her control them." Greg frowned, his brow furrowing as he thought it over. "Careful with that, Jared. If you go too far, she'll come back at you. You'll be giving her ammunition. Maybe it's better to just let it go." Jared's jaw tightened. He wasn't ready to let it go. "Not yet. I'm not looking to start a war," he said finally, his voice steady but resolute. "But I'm not going to sit by and let her get away with this. Not after everything she's put me through. Greg studied him for a long moment, then sighed. I get it. Just make sure you don't burn yourself in the process. Jared nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. He wasn't sure what his next move would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't backing down. The following weekend, Jared began to execute his plan. It wasn't a full-blown assault on Diane's leadership. He wasn't interested in starting a personal vendetta, but he knew that getting the truth out was the first step toward reclaiming his peace and restoring the balance in the neighborhood. His goal was to expose her overreach without outright attacking her, which would only give her more ammunition to use against him. Jared spent the evening drafting emails. He started by reaching out to a few key neighbors, ones he had spoken with. Over the past few months, some of them had already started to show cracks in their loyalty to Diane, having grown tired of her controlling behavior. Jared chose them carefully, people who were level-headed and would understand the importance of getting the truth out in a respectful, calm manner. He began each email with a simple message. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. About what happened with the pond? The situation has gotten out of hand, and I think it's important that everyone knows what's really going on. Jared then included a copy of the EPA email clearing his property of any wrongdoing, highlighting that the fine had been revoked and that he had followed all legal guidelines. He didn't embellish or exaggerate. He simply let the facts speak for themselves. Jared didn't send these messages blindly. He wanted to make sure they would be well received. Before hitting send, he carefully reviewed each recipient, making sure they were open-minded enough to see Diane's actions for what they were, an overstep of authority. Motivated by personal bias and fueled by the control she wielded over the community. It wasn't long before he started receiving replies, each one a mix of disbelief and support. Some people expressed genuine concern about Diane's actions, while others were quietly furious, but hadn't had the courage to speak up before. One neighbor, Margaret, responded, "Thank you for reaching out. I've been hesitant to get involved, but now I see that you were just trying to do the right thing. I'll speak to the others." Another, Sam, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, wrote, "I've seen Diane push things too far before. This might be the tipping point." Jared couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope. The more people that understood the truth, the less Diane's influence would matter. It was a slow burn, but it was working. By the following Sunday, whispers were spreading throughout the neighborhood. People who had previously avoided making waves were now openly discussing the pond situation. Jared didn't actively campaign for this, but as the truth seeped through, Diane's facade began to crack. At first, she denied everything. When a neighbor stopped by to talk to her, she dismissed the claims as rumors and tried to downplay the situation. But as more people came forward, and as her grip on the community weakened, her defensive walls began to crumble. The pressure of having her wrongdoings exposed slowly wore her down. Greg was one of the first to approach Jared about it after the neighborhood meeting. He had been a quiet ally since the start, and Jared was grateful for his calm and reasoned approach. "You've done well, Jared. People are talking." "Diane's starting to look like a fool," Greg said, leaning against the fence in his backyard. His eyes flickered with a mix of amusement and concern. "But you know how these things go. The harder she fights, the more damage she'll do. She won't let it go quietly." Jared nodded, his eyes hardening. "I'm not letting her off the hook. This isn't just about my pond, it's about the way she's treated people around here. She's used her position as HOA president to control everyone, intimidate them, and manipulate the rules." Greg paused, considering Jared's words. "You're right. She's always had her way because people are too afraid to stand up. But it's not just Diane anymore. The others, they're starting to see through her, and you've got the proof." Jared exhaled, a tension he didn't realize he'd been carrying melting away as he spoke. "I didn't do this to start a war, Greg. I just wanted to protect myself, my property, my peace. But she pushed me into this corner, and now it feels like it's bigger than just me." Greg's expression softened, the weight of understanding settling between them. "I know, Jared, and I respect you for how you've handled it. But if you're going to go after her, Make sure you're not just focused on this pond issue. Diane's been making a lot of decisions without anyone questioning her. It's time for everyone to know who she really is." The conversation lingered. With Jared for the rest of the weekend, he wasn't about to back down, but the last thing he wanted was to become the villain in this drama. He wasn't interested in starting a crusade, but he understood what Greg was saying. Diane had done more damage than just mismanaging the HOA. She had allowed her power to overrule common sense, bullying people who simply wanted to live in peace. This was his chance to take back that peace for everyone, not just himself. That evening, he sat down at his kitchen table, drafting a final message. He sent it to all of his neighbors, this time a little more direct than before. He addressed the community, not as a victim, but as someone who had been wronged and was now standing up for what was right. He explained the situation once again, but this time he framed it within the larger context of Diane's behavior. He didn't attack her personally, but he made it clear that her actions were reflective of a larger pattern of control and exploitation. He asked everyone to take a moment and think about the kind of leadership they wanted in the neighborhood, one that respected individual rights and worked collaboratively, or one that enforced its own rules without consideration for fairness. The responses were immediate and powerful. Some people were cautiously supportive, others openly furious at Diane for what she had done. It became clear that Jared was not alone in his desire for change. The tide had shifted, and it was now undeniable. Diane had underestimated the strength of a community united by the truth. Jared wasn't sure what the final outcome would be, but as the days passed, he felt a growing sense of victory. Diane's influence waned with each passing conversation. He knew that the neighborhood wouldn't be the same after this, whether or not Diane stepped down. But for the first time in a long while, Jared felt like the scales were tipping in his favor. This wasn't just about a pond anymore. It was about standing up to those who thought they could get away with using their power to hurt others. Jared wasn't about to let that happen, not to him and not to anyone else in the neighborhood. The following week, the community meeting was scheduled. This was the moment that Jared had been preparing for, the chance to face Diane and the rest of the HOA members head-on. He knew Diane would try to regain control of the narrative, but Jared had a clear strategy. He wasn't going to attack her directly. Instead, he would let the truth do the work. Diane had already done enough damage with her missteps, and it was time for everyone else to see her for what she really was. The meeting room was packed, with residents filling every seat and standing along the back walls. Jared could feel the tension in the air as soon as he walked in. The usual placid atmosphere of the HOA meetings was gone. People were restless, their whispers louder than ever. Jared stood by the door for a moment, surveying the room. Diane was already at the front, sitting at her usual position at the head of the table, her eyes darting nervously around the room as she adjusted her notes. She had clearly spent the last few days trying to prepare her defense, but Jared could sense the cracks in her carefully constructed armor. He took a seat near the back, across from Greg, who gave him a nod of silent support. Jared's heart was pounding, but he wasn't nervous. He knew that all he had to do was stand firm and let the facts speak for themselves. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Diane opened with a list of agenda items, her voice strong but strained. Jared's mind wandered as she spoke, but he kept his eyes on her, watching for any signs of weakness. The first few items passed quickly, mostly routine matters that didn't concern him. But as the discussion turned to neighborhood issues, Jared knew it was time to act. Diane cleared her throat and began, "As many of you are aware, there's been some concern about Jared's recent modifications to his property, the pond." She paused, her eyes flicking to Jared with barely concealed hostility. "Has caused quite a stir. And, as we all know, the EPA fine is still hanging over us." The room grew quiet at her words. Jared's pulse quickened. This was it. Diane was still trying to paint him as the villain. Jared stood up slowly, his voice calm but cutting. "Actually, Diane, the EPA cleared my pond. There's no fine, and there never was. The EPA sent me a revised inspection report, and I've got a copy right here." He held up his phone, showing the email from the EPA, and handed it to Greg. Greg passed the phone to the person next to him, and soon the whole room was reading the email. Jared let the silence stretch for a moment before he continued, his voice firm. I followed all the proper channels before I made any changes. I didn't just act on a whim. I did what I thought was right, but Diane and the HOA decided to take matters into their own hands. Now, we're all dealing with the fallout from that decision. Diane's face turned red, and for a moment, it looked like she might snap. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jared held up a hand. This isn't about me anymore. This is about the way things are run around here. For too long, Diane has made decisions for the entire neighborhood without asking for anyone's input. We've all been too afraid to speak up, and I think it's time we change that. Greg stood up next, his voice calm and authoritative. That's right, Diane has been running roughshod over everyone here for too long. We've let her make decisions without questioning them, and it's time for that to stop. We need a leader who listens, not one who forces their will on the rest of us. Jared looked around the room, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. It was clear that the tide had shifted. Some people were nodding, others were whispering among themselves. Diane's grip on the room was slipping, and for the first time, she was losing control. Diane slammed her hand down on the table, her voice shaking with anger. You can't just do this, Jared. You think you've won. You think that because you got a piece of paper from the EPA, everything is fine? You're going to regret this. All of you are going to regret this. Jared's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he saw something flicker in her gaze, something close to fear. The people who had once been too scared to speak up were now beginning to rally behind him, and Diane knew it. Her power was slipping, and she didn't know how to stop it. I'm not here to fight you, Diane, Jared said, his voice steady. But I'm not going to sit by and let you keep treating people like this. We all deserve better. The room was silent as everyone absorbed Jared's words. Diane's breathing was heavy, her face flushed with frustration, but she said nothing more. Jared knew the battle wasn't over, but he had made his point. The neighborhood wasn't going to let her push them around anymore. The rest of the meeting passed in a tense, quiet. Jared didn't need to say much more. The damage had been done. Diane's authority was shattered, and she could no longer hide behind her aggressive tactics. It wasn't just about the pond anymore, it was about the future of the community and how it would be governed. As the meeting adjourned, Jared felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a victory just yet, but it was a turning point. The neighbors who had once feared Diane were now looking at her with suspicion. Jared wasn't the villain here, he was the one who had been wronged, and he wasn't going to let that go quietly. He stepped out of the meeting room, his heart still racing but filled with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't done yet. This fight wasn't over. But for the first time, Jared felt like he had the support he needed to see it through. In the days that followed the community meeting, the changes were palpable. The HOA's usual rigid structure seemed to crack as residents began speaking out, more openly discussing everything from the pond situation to their general dissatisfaction with Diane's leadership. Jared could feel the shift, the air heavier with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Diane, who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist, was now on the defensive, scrambling to keep control of a situation that was slipping further away. From her dot, Jared had expected some backlash from Diane, but what surprised him was how quickly the support for her had eroded. The neighbors who had once hesitated to confront her were now stepping up in small ways. Conversations in the yard, casual greetings on morning walks, all now laced with the subtle undertones of change. Diane's influence had been cracked wide open, and now the cracks were widening. One afternoon, Jared was out in his backyard, tending to the garden that bordered the now stone-filled pond, when Greg came over, leaning against the fence with a thoughtful expression. You were right, Greg said, nodding toward the house across the street. I just got back from talking to the Ryans next door. They said they're done with Diane. Told me they've been wanting to speak out for months, but they were too afraid to go against her. That meeting was the final straw. Jared wiped his hands on his pants and glanced at Greg, surprised. Really? They're speaking up now. Greg gave a slow, knowing smile. It's happening all over the neighborhood. People are starting to talk. They see the truth now. Jared exhaled deeply, the weight of his actions settling in. He hadn't anticipated how quickly the tide would turn. But it wasn't just the pond. It was everything Diane had done, the way she dismissed their concerns, manipulated her position, and acted as if the neighborhood belonged to her. She hadn't just targeted him, she had eroded the trust of the entire community. Greg took a step closer, his expression serious. You need to be careful now. Diane's not one to back down easily. She'll come at you again, and when she does, she hit where it hurts. Jared nodded. He knew this wasn't over. Diane's pride would never let her admit defeat, and, now that her power was in jeopardy, she would stop at nothing to regain it. He had seen how she'd reacted in the meeting, the way her words were sharp, biting. She had been rattled, but that didn't mean she was done. The next few days were a blur. Diane's absence was noticeable in the neighborhood. She didn't make her usual rounds, didn't show up at the mailbox or stand at the front window glaring at the kids playing outside, but Jared knew she was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. It came sooner than he expected. One evening, as Jared was sitting on his porch, enjoying the cool breeze, his phone rang. It was from the HOA's lawyer. Jared listened carefully as the lawyer explained that Diane was filing a lawsuit against him for slander and damaging the HOA's reputation. His heart sank, but he wasn't surprised. Diane's attack on his character was expected. She wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Do you think she has a case? Jared asked, trying to keep his voice steady. It's a weak case, the lawyer said, clearly trying to downplay the situation. But she'd drag it out, try to wear you down. You'll have to respond, of course, but I don't see it going anywhere. Jared hung up the phone, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the pond anymore. It was about Diane's attempt to ruin him, to silence him. The strategy was clear. If she couldn't control him through the HOA, she would try to do so through the legal system. Greg was the first person Jared called. She's going to try to sue me, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. She's accusing me of slander. She's not giving up. Greg sighed, but there was a note of quiet resolve in his voice. She's desperate now, Jared, but don't let her win. You've got the truth on your side. This is just another tactic. To try to intimidate you, you keep fighting, and the rest of us will have your back. Jared took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid. He had come too far to back down now. The legal battle would be difficult, no doubt, but he had the support of the neighborhood, and more importantly, he had the truth. I'm not going to let her do this, Jared said, determination flooding his chest. I'll fight. I'll fight until the end. It was clear that this wasn't just a fight for his reputation anymore, it was a fight for the future of the neighborhood. He had already exposed Diane for what she was, but now, with the legal threat hanging over his head, he would show her that he wasn't going to let her destroy everything he had worked for. Jared knew that this was the turning point. The battle wasn't over, but with each move, each step forward, he was making it clear. He wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for all of them. The legal battle with Diane began to drag on longer than Jared had anticipated. What had started as a simple dispute over his pond was now a drawn-out fight that threatened to consume him. Diane's lawsuit for slander was a calculated move, an attempt to intimidate him into silence, but Jared wasn't backing down. The more Diane pushed, the more the neighborhood rallied around him. The first few court hearings were exhausting. Jared had to hire a lawyer, something he hadn't expected, but he knew it was necessary. Diane's legal team was relentless, trying to drag out the process and paint him as the villain. Every time Jared thought they were getting closer to an end, Diane found a way to delay or throw in a new accusation. She was desperate, and it showed at one of the hearings. As Jared sat in the sterile, uncomfortable courtroom, he found himself thinking back to that first confrontation with Diane, when she stood in his backyard accusing him of destroying the neighborhood. He had been angry then, but now, with the weight of the legal system pressing down on him, he felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. His lawyer, a calm and collected woman named Rachel, had warned him from the beginning that Diane would use every trick in the book to wear him down. "She's playing the long game," Rachel had said. "She knows that most people will give up when things get tough. But we've got the truth on our side. Don't let her make you doubt yourself." Jared had clung to that advice, but it wasn't always easy. Every court appearance, every new delay, seemed like another obstacle to overcome. Diane wasn't just fighting him. She was trying to destroy the peace of the neighborhood, to prove that no one was safe from her wrath. But as the weeks wore on, Jared noticed something changing. The support from his neighbors, from people he had never expected to rally behind him, continued to grow. It wasn't just Greg or Margaret or Sam anymore. People Jared had barely spoken to before were now openly criticizing Diane, sharing stories of her overreach and how they had been afraid to speak out for years. Jared had given them the courage to stand up, and they were taking that power and using it to push back against her. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling court session, Jared came home to find a group of neighbors gathered outside his house. There was no agenda, no planned protest. They were just there, offering their support. People were bringing food, offering to help with whatever needed doing around the house, and most of all, they were standing with him. They were showing up in ways that no one had done for Diane. Greg was there, as always, leaning on the fence. "We're with you, Jared, all the way," he said quietly. His voice was firm, but there was a warmth in his words that Jared hadn't expected. Jared nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude. He had never imagined that this fight would bring the neighborhood closer together, but it had. People were no longer intimidated by Diane, no longer afraid to challenge her. They had seen what she was capable of, and they weren't going to let her have her way anymore. Then, just as things began to settle into a new rhythm of support and solidarity, Jared received the call that would change everything. Rachel's voice on the phone was tight with anticipation. "Jared, we've just received a settlement offer from Diane's team. She's willing to drop the lawsuit if you agree to an official apology and pay a small fine for disrupting the HOA's reputation." Jared felt a cold wave wash over him. The offer was a trap, an attempt to get him to admit fault when he had done nothing wrong. If he accepted, it would be a public concession, a tacit admission that he had in some way wronged the HOA. And more importantly, it would give Diane victory she didn't deserve. "Don't take it," Greg advised when Jared explained the situation later that day. "Don't give her that satisfaction. You've already exposed her for what she is." Jared didn't need much more convincing. He had fought too hard, too long, to back down now. He called Rachel back, rejecting the settlement offer with a firmness that surprised even him. "I won't apologize," he told her. "I didn't do anything wrong. Diane can keep trying to intimidate me, but I won't give her that victory." The next few days were filled with a tense calm. Diane's legal team hadn't given up, but her options were running thin. It became clear that her attempt to drag Jared through the courts wasn't going to work. The truth was on his side, and while the legal battle had been draining, he had the support of his neighbors, his community. It wasn't just a fight for his property anymore. It was a fight for the very fabric of the neighborhood and what kind of place they wanted to live. As the pressure mounted, Diane finally made the decision that no one had expected. She withdrew the lawsuit. The community had rallied too strongly. The truth had been exposed, and Diane was left with no other option but to walk away. Jared stood on his porch that evening looking out at the quiet street. The victory wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had stood with him. The neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. The fear, the intimidation, the quiet acceptance of Diane's rule, those things were gone. In their place was a new sense of community, of people willing to stand up and demand better. Diane had lost, but in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the power of standing up for what was right, about fighting for fairness, and about reminding each other that no one should ever be afraid to speak the truth. As the sun set, Jared felt the weight of the past months lift from his shoulders. The battle had been long and hard, but he had won. And in doing so, he had changed the course of the neighborhood forever.